Can New York City produce multi-billion-dollar value companies, and is it just a matter of time? So Nick, could you start, because you looked at the data?
New York certainly can produce billion-dollar companies. It has produced a number recently, so Shutterstock, Tumblr, Market Access, perhaps most notably. I think the biggest successes are still private, are still in the pipeline and have not yet exited. Companies, two of Kevin's, Gilt and MongoDB, also companies like AppNexus and Etsy. So I think the trends are very positive. And I think patience is a helpful virtue in understanding this topic. Tech ecosystems evolve in waves. And certainly you can look back at Silicon Valley in 7th or 8th wave, depending on how you count. New York is really in its 3rd, and it's just the nature of the evolution of ecosystems that with each wave you get more wins, and the wins tend to get bigger as experienced entrepreneurs and senior executives join the next set of companies. Kevin's an example of that, who's participated in all of the waves in New York. And I think if you ask how does New York stack up to Silicon Valley, it may be a little bit of a misleading question, because I think New York is a different kind of tech ecosystem than Silicon Valley. It's really, in my view, an applied technology ecosystem with two killer assets. One is world-class domain expertise in a number of information-centric industries that are being most radically transformed by information technology today. Industries like media, advertising, marketing services, financial services. And now that the technology has gotten cheaper and easier, there's so much innovation that's just disrupting all of these industries. And often you need domain expertise to start those companies. So New York has seen a lot of those. The second killer asset, I think New York has one of the most impressive sort of creative classes on the globe in fields like in the arts and design and architecture and in financial engineering. You know, it's a city with a very high creative density. And if you look at the evolution of information technology generally, I think it's no longer just a sector. It's diffusing into every sector. And every industry is being digitized, and the power of information technology in the hands of creators is greater than it's ever been. So I would argue that some of New York's biggest successes could not have been created in Silicon Valley because they require that kind of domain expertise that New York has. So it's certainly true that you could not have built Intel, obviously, in New York, but I think it's equally true you could not have built Bloomberg or Gilt to the same level of success in Silicon Valley. I would also argue that just given the creative density that I mentioned earlier in New York will continue to produce a number of unexpectedly successful companies and unexpected industries. It's interesting that in addition to dominating ad tech, financial services, and so on in the information technology area, New York has also evolved as leader in such diverse fields as 3D printing with Shapeways and MakerBot, and product financing platforms with companies like Kickstarter. So I think in answer to the question, yes, New York has and will continue to produce multi-billion-dollar companies. But it's early. We're in our 3rd wave, and I think the waves will continue to get bigger.
Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a real debate on this issue. Also, I think it's being defined unfairly because when people talk about the Bay Area, they talk about examples like Twitter or Yahoo, which are 60 miles apart, and Priceline is closer to this building than those two companies are apart. But somehow we don't get credit for that. So we're having a conversation: can Connecticut produce a company much bigger than Twitter in value, $40 billion? The answer is yes. So I really think that New York can. It's just coincidence whether it happens or not. So look, let's not forget that it's only 15 years ago where New York had 0. I mean, literally 0. The first 100 employees at DoubleClick, no one had worked at a startup before because there were no startups. And so now, we're having a debate whether we can be the biggest startup place in the entire country, and the answer is not yet. That's hard to do in 15 years. If you take subsectors, we're already, like in online media, San Francisco's not even very relevant. New York completely dominates. BuzzFeed is here, Huffington Post is here, Business Insider is here, Gawker's here. All the large companies in the online media space are really here. So it'll take time. You're also watching, what I love watching is just how you have one company start, and then you watch 2nd or 3rd generation. So I know DoubleClick's numbers. There's 34 people we've identified who are now CEOs who worked at DoubleClick, and the majority of them in New York. Then you're watching that. People who leave Gilt start e-commerce companies. People who leave Mongo start enterprise software companies. And I think, for me, Mongo is a good example. It happens to be mine, but it's exactly the type of business that if we were sitting here 4 years ago, you would have said, well, in enterprise software, in databases, which is the hardest core the guts, the most difficult technical problem, New York isn't going to be able to do that. And the answer is that in the NoSQL area, which is the fastest growing area, Mongo is the dominant player. All the competitors are in San Francisco. Mongo's winning, and that will be another beginning of a subset of the sector. So anyway, New York's doing great.
I think about economic impact and economic growth really holistically. We just did an economic impact study looking at the impact of tech on New York City's economy, and I think startup valuation and venture investing, all of that is definitely a component of it, but it doesn't tell the whole story. And to your point a little bit, I mean, we're seeing tech is not a vertical, tech is a horizontal in New York. It cuts across every single industry. And when we actually looked at job creation, there's been huge job creation in tech in New York over the last 10 years. We've seen an 18% increase in job creation in tech here in the city versus 4% nationwide. But when we look at where those jobs are coming from, yes, there's a whole bunch of jobs being generated by tech startups, and that's amazing. But what we actually found is that there are more tech jobs in non-tech companies now in New York than there are tech jobs in tech companies. So when you start really digging into looking at Citibank, looking at New York Times, these companies are hiring people into tech roles at very rapid rates and really, in a lot of ways, turning into tech companies. And I think that's one of the things that makes New York a very sustainable tech ecosystem, is that we're not reliant just on sort of one source of powering the economy. We're really changing every industry in the city. And I think it creates a great cycle, too, of having people who might be a developer for Hertz.com or for Macy's or for New York Times, and that same person can then cycle into the startup space, potentially branch off, build their own company, and it creates, I think, a much more robust and diverse ecosystem here in the city.
The way I think about it is more at a fundamental level. Where do people want to live? Companies are nothing more than a conglomeration of the people that are doing it. In New York, and particularly, it's kind of just think about this area and the turnaround in the last 15 or 20 years of this area. And so basically, I think there's a lot of talented, energetic, thoughtful, entrepreneurial people who want to live in New York. And historically, New York, to me, always had some problems in finding technical talent. That Wall Street was paying so much that engineers, software programmers, and such would just flock to Wall Street. And it was pretty hard to pull people away from that. But as Wall Street has kind of reduced the number of people that they're hiring, moved jobs offshore, and become a little bit less of an interesting place, that's not become the key attractor for technical talent. And as I was saying to Jeff earlier, I think the Cornell Tech campus is going to be a really big help for New York. I think having another place, an institution that's generating people who are focused on applied engineering and development, coupled with the energetic sort of marketplace, market-driven people. But I think of San Francisco and the Bay Area as kind of like a company town. Like everybody's doing the same thing. Like it's like watching that TV show Silicon Valley. There isn't something quite like that in New York. It's a more of a palette. There's lots of different colors, lots of different kinds of people, lots of things going on. So I think it's a good place, and I think that's one of the reasons why it'll continue to grow and attract a lot of interesting companies.
I just want to say I'm set up to be lynched afterwards, but I did grow up in New York. I love New York. I want New York to succeed, and I would love to have a board in New York because I have family here. My brother still lives here. My mom lives here. So with that, Jeff asked me to play devil's advocate. So I'm going to play devil's advocate. Look, it's not about a competition between New York and Silicon Valley. I think if you want to if you had to ask, the question that Fred got asked was, do you want to invest in New York or the rest of the world? You'd say the rest of the world. There's a lot of opportunity in the rest of the world than New York. If you had to ask me the same question, would I rather invest in San Francisco, the Bay Area, compared to the rest of the world? I would also say I would invest in the rest of the world. A startup gets started, it's a local business. It's local because the DNA gets set by the people around that company. Those people are going to be hired locally, at least for now. That may change over time. And setting the right DNA is important. And I think you have a situation in Silicon Valley where, there's a comparison between New York and Silicon Valley. New York is much younger. Silicon Valley has been around since 1930s. And so there's been many, many generations. And that is helpful for Silicon Valley. I think some of the comments made here about the diversity here, that's great. New York has a lot of diversity. That's also a distraction. If you believe in competitive advantage, a focus on one thing will win over being broad. And here, there's a lot of stuff that is great about New York, and I love living in New York, and I want to move back. I want to retire here. But there are lots of distractions. I have 2 partners here who flew out here. Part of the reason they want to be here on a Friday is because they can go out on Saturday and have fun. They're not doing that in San Francisco, I can tell you that for a fact. The tech ecosystem being broader here is a good thing from a sustainability standpoint, but it's not a great thing from a focus standpoint. I think a lot of great companies are being built here, but there are very few that are deep tech. MongoDB is a departure from that, and I think that's great. I would love to see more deep tech companies being built in New York City, and a lot of the New York companies end up opening up offices in the Bay Area. The reason why MongoDB, people think it's a Bay Area company, is it's on its website. It's dual headquartered in New York and Palo Alto. The CEO lives in Palo Alto. So, do you have an office in the Bay Area?
Yeah, we have one in downtown San Francisco.
So I think there's just a lot of things that are difficult about New York from a focus standpoint. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll save my other comments for later.
And I feel like that's because New York is like the 8th most important thing going on. I'm sorry, tech is like the 8th most important thing happening in New York, after fashion, media, finance, music, blah blah blah. There's it's like there's 5 or 6 different things that happen before people are really wanting to dig into to tech, and I think that's a great thing that really defines it here. On top of that, it's interesting. Like, I really subscribe to this idea of like the generations of entrepreneurs that we're seeing in New York, and the generations of tech startups. Like when I agree that we're on our 3rd generation, and when I was doing Dodgeball, which I think was the 2nd generation of tech here in New York, like there was no support at all for us. Like there was no angels, there was no one for us to talk to. There were very few VCs here. We didn't know what to do, and so we went out and we ended up bringing the company to Google out west. When we were starting Foursquare in 2009, I mean, that's like the beginning of the 3rd generation, or right around the start of it. And there was a little bit more infrastructure here. Google had been around. There was engineers to pull out of Google. There were people that had left that were looking to invest in companies, and there was a couple other VCs that were here. We had some people that had gone through exits. And I think that was 5 years ago. And if you look at what's going on now, like there's so many more folks that are in the ecosystem, so many more folks that are willing to mentor people, to help make introductions, so many more companies to pull engineers from. It's like you can just do things now that you couldn't do 5 years ago, and the things that you could do 5 years ago didn't even exist 5 years before that. And so, it's really, I think if we look back at this conversation 5 years from now, I think it's going to seem kind of silly, because if you look at just how quickly things are evolving, and if you get to the point where New York is on the 5th generation or 6th generation, I think the scene's going to look entirely different.
Now, but because I wanted to test and see whether there were women out there who were willing to come and demo at a women's only demo night that weren't coming to New York Tech Meetup. When I put out the call for applications, we had 47 female-founded companies apply. And then I did another call for applications and got another 40 more. That was 90 female-founded tech companies that came forward over a span of 3 months, most of whom I had never seen apply to demo at New York Tech Meetup. And so I think some of it is, it can be a bit intimidating. It can feel unwelcoming. There are absolutely, ask any woman who's been in tech for a long time if she's ever had a negative experience dealing with an investor, potentially asking her out on a date, making really inappropriate remarks. It happens to everyone. I didn't believe it when I first came into the sector. I was in Girl Scouts before, totally like women empowered, supporting women, like never had to worry about any of that. And I kind of didn't believe that this was still truly happening at this day and age. And it happens every single day, all the time. And so I think there's still a lot of discomfort in this space. I mean, even, you all are wonderful. Walking in here this morning, someone said to me, "What, are they keeping all the women in a separate room?" Because walked in and it was a sea of men. And I don't think it's anything to do with, the organizers here. It's reflective of what we're still seeing in the tech space. And so I think it's definitely a challenge that that I think we need all of the men in the room to work on. And it's not just about women, getting women in tech, it's also just about the diversity of tech in general. And I would love to see New York's tech community actually be reflective of the diversity in New York's overall community.